know who has access to what? This is the Identity at the Center podcast. If you're looking for identity and access management talk, you've come to the right place. And now, on to the show.
Welcome to yet another episode of the Identity at the Center podcast. Certainly been appreciating the likes and ratings we've been getting. If you like what you hear, do us a favor, share the show with other like-minded individuals. And you can also email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com. I am Jeff, and that is Jim's voice you're about to hear. Jim?
Hey, Jeff. Survived the hurricane.
Survived the hurricane. Well, so far, anyway.
Well, I'm 100 miles inland, and that helped.
Yeah, so then I guess I'm a hurricane survivor as well, too, being up in the Chicago area.
That's right.
Yeah. We were joined today by Morgan McNamara. She's one of our crack members of our engineering team here at Identropy. Hello, Morgan.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Good. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem.
So, Jeff, I want to clarify. By being a crack member, that doesn't mean you smoke crack, right?
They don't have, well, that's a personal question. I don't think that that's probably right for the podcast. I think as long as the work gets done, hey, man, whatever.
Could be a
Not that I'm condoning that behavior.
Yeah, all right. There you go.
So today is Thursday. Do you know what today is, Jim? Morgan, take a guess. Other than, podcast day.
Thursdays are OWASP days.
It's an OWASP day. It's not that. It is the opening night of the NFL.
Ooh.
Bears-Packers. My Bears actually are looking good now, so there's a chance that we might actually beat the Packers on Thursday Night Football tonight to open the season. I'm very excited about this.
Now, those teams have probably played about 100 times.
Yeah, and it's relatively even though the Packers seem like they've been dominating the Bears for the last decade or so. The actual overall record is relatively close, which makes it one of the better rivalries.
Yeah, cool.
Morgan, do you have a team that you follow in the NFL?
Oh, God. Out of obligation, I have to say the Buffalo Bills.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
Go Bills. My dad was a Bills fan, so I get you on that one. He's from Newfane and Rochester area, so yeah, the Bills were his team.
Okay, yeah, that's like right next to me. I'm from Buffalo, so try your hardest, Bills.
Jim, do you follow a team?
Eagles.
Oh, that's right, Eagles, of course. Did you see that the Eagles offensive line did the ESPN body issue?
No.
Yeah, so if that's your thing, the Eagles offensive line was featured.
Let's be clear, it's not.
This is the first time in 25 years of NFL football that I'm not doing a fantasy football league. And I got to tell you, I find it to be quite freeing. I'm actually going to be able to watch the games and enjoy them rather than wonder, how my running backs did or are, having second thoughts around not starting one guy and him on the bench. So
I stopped doing it about 10 years ago, and I feel the same way. It was ruining the game for me. And I did the same thing with fantasy baseball where it's I was just so concerned with how individual players were doing it that it was, ruining the sport for me. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there listening, period. But there are a lot of people out there listening who play fantasy sports and love it. And I used to love it, but I'm with you, man. It's freeing.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I just decided not to do it this year. And there's a certain, freedom aspect to it. Anyway, all right, let's actually talk about identity and access management and get us back on track here. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that was submitted to us by Neil, who listens to the show. Certainly appreciate his email. Let me go right into here what he writes. One area that I think would be pertinent to discuss is around the managing of identity in a multi-cloud environment. There is a growing movement toward vendor-agnostic use of cloud services, and this drives some new thinking around how we approach identity. Do we centralize or distribute identity management? And he thinks that'd make a good subject, which I absolutely agree with. So let's start off with, why do companies have multi-cloud environments? Morgan, do you want to take a stab at that? And then Jim and I will chime in.
My assumption would be that, they have different platforms, different languages that they're using, and they're trying to sort of sequester each one of those to try and make it as secure as possible instead of integrating them all together in a single cloud instance.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. Jeff, what I found is most clients that I work with are either in one of two camps. They're either in a single cloud environment, so they're using something like AWS or Microsoft Azure, and those are, definitely the two that I see the largest uptake on, at least the client base that we've been working with, or they're in a multi-cloud and they have more than one, so they have AWS and Azure hosting. And so the ones that I find that are in that second scenario, and to be honest, I'm not an expert in the features of AWS, the features of Azure, or any of the other cloud platforms. But from the level that I'm at, there seems to be a lot of feature parity. I'm sure there's people out there pulling their hair out with me saying that, but for the most part, I'm finding that most clients aren't choosing AWS or Azure based on this feature or that feature, but more which company they align with better. Now, where I see the situation where a client has multiple clouds, maybe they even have multiple kind of instances within the same provider, it's kind of been thrust upon them in that their organization, grew through acquisition or merger, or they, purchased some software that was on one of the clouds and they were already on the other cloud, or that, some decisions were made within their organization. One part of the organization went Microsoft, the other part went AWS. Now they're coming together and kind of starting to manage IT together. And so in other words, they're kind of thrust into that situation. They didn't really choose multi-cloud. It just kind of happened.
Yeah. I see I look at it like from a use case perspective, right? If you're, and the idea that there's different parts of the business that have different use cases kind of plays into what you just said. If you're on the SharePoint side, or if you're, email, you're probably familiar with Azure from a cloud perspective, but there might be someone who is more on the Google side because of the strength of the analytics side that they might be having. So they're more familiar with that, and they might have gone off and built something on Google's cloud platform, whereas, developers might be looking at AWS and spinning up, services there. So pulling things together is certainly, part of the challenge, I think, that comes along with it. But in my mind, I think it kind of goes with that use case, right? So if you're an Office 365 shop, you're on Azure, whether you like it or not, you're already using Azure from that approach. And then it becomes that question of, okay, well, we're already using here, right? Land and expand, which is, the approach many software vendors will take is, why don't you use, Azure for the rest of your cloud services? Whereas company might have, other pockets of AWS. And I think that's pretty common. I think a lot of companies try to consolidate on one, but I like the security aspect that Morgan, you mentioned before, around having things in kind of a little bit of a different silo where you don't have all your keys in one castle. So, I think there is benefit to that as well, using the right tool for the job rather than trying to make, one service meet all your needs when it may not be the best for the business.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could just jump in and mention something interesting that I noticed when you guys were discussing that was that it's almost like there's this sort of resistance in a sense to complete migration to cloud infrastructure, because when you think of implementation of a cloud, it's really dissolving the traditional perimeters that we've seen that have relied on things like a firewall and VPN. It's just those just aren't as viable anymore. You're looking at a cross-platform system where you're trying to simplify the IT stack. That elimination of the perimeter is going to demand some sort of seamless implementation with a centralized user management tool. And it almost sounds like companies are kind of afraid to do that, and they're trying to almost reestablish perimeters where they just tried to migrate to a fragmentation of it.
Yeah, I think the perimeter's gone at this point. I think that's a losing effort if you're trying to establish perimeter on the cloud. Jim, what are some of the problems that you see if you're taking a multi-cloud approach?
Well, I think the biggest problem is the same if you have a single cloud approach, which is, but it's obviously compounded. The biggest problem is the number of secrets or credentials that it takes to run a large cloud environment. You have secrets or credentials for the console to access infrastructure. Within your applications, they're embedded within configuration files or embedded service accounts. So the volume of the number of credentials that you have to manage is in kind of a controlled fashion just becomes such a major effort. That's really the problem. And when you go to a multi-cloud, now you've compounded that. You have as many as twice as many secrets that you need to manage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a visibility issue too, right? If the cloud isn't being managed centrally, right? Some areas probably have different procedures and processes and policies for their own cloud, right? AWS might be managed different than Azure or Google. And you may not have that visibility to know who has access to what. Was really kind of foundational for any IAM program, which it would be part of the security strategy.
Yeah, I mean, think of how much companies struggle to comply with their own policies in terms of password rotation when it comes to service accounts. Now you're looking at a new environment that oftentimes, a cloud environment that spun up without information security having a hands-on role. Now, I'm talking in generalities, right? Not every organization spun up their cloud infrastructure that way. But now you've got thousands of credentials that have to be managed and passwords that need to be rotated in compliance. And you may or may not have a technology solution supporting that. So I think that's really the problem. And then when you have multi-cloud, now you just picked up and repeated that same kind of problem in a second place or more. Or you could be talking about an internal private cloud. No matter how you look at it, the more places that you have to manage all these credentials, the harder the problem becomes to manage.
So it sounds like an answer might be some sort of centralization strategy across the cloud, or at least from a management standpoint.
I mean, that's the answer to, so I think this gets to Neil's question because he was saying, should we take a centralized approach or distributed approach? I'm definitely in the camp of a centralized approach. I want centralized command and control, centralized visibility into who has access to what they've done. And I want to put together some guidelines or best practices that I can, put into effect in terms of managing those identities within the cloud. And, I've got some topics that I'd like to dive into or kind of best practices that I think that, and kind of taking an approach of you've got to walk before you run. Obviously, people who are listening to this podcast could be in different organizations that are at a different point in their life cycle, that have different types of applications are running in different clouds. So I'm going to kind of start at the most basic level in terms of here are the approaches that I think need to be tackled, and then we'll get into the more advanced stuff.
All right, let's hit it. What's number one?
Okay, so starting on, from the basics, strong authentication practices. So, starting with the assumption that you've got good practices for managing identity. So just thinking of your employees, including the population of people who do administrative developer functions in the cloud, you've got good lifecycle management or identity governance practices for those people today. Who works here, who gets access to what, and most importantly, when they leave, that you're cutting off that access. And if you have that and you kind of centralize that, say, around your Active Directory, then you can plug in your access to the cloud through your corporate single sign-on solution or PAM solution. I think, either one of those technologies is kind of trying to solve this problem. But what I see the most is organizations starting with managing the console, kind of the management interface for their cloud, and guarding that, providing single sign-on to that with their SSO solution, so like Okta or Ping or OneLogin or something like that. And then ideally on top of
a PAM solution work with that approach as well? something like
Yeah, I mean a PAM solution.
Psychotic or HashiCorp or CyberArk?
Yeah, a lot of those vendors have solutions developed around Azure and AWS specifically. I think AWS is probably the one that I see addressed the most, but I think every solution that's trying to tackle this problem is really focused on providing a solution for AWS as well as Microsoft. So yeah, there are solutions out there that would allow you to use your PAM solution, which has its own set of benefits. Those benefits are kind of more down the line of more advanced benefits than what I was planning on going through at the moment, because what I wanted to talk about next was, with authentication. So if we're just talking about access to the console at the moment and providing single sign-on, using your account that has good IGA practices around it, that's getting disabled when you leave the organization. On top of that, I want to layer multi-factor authentication because your web console is going to be available over the open internet, and we want to make sure that we're providing a very strong authentication to log in.
So you've got MFA, you got strong credentials. Morgan, I know you had some experience working through AWS. When you're logging into AWS, did you have MFA enabled when you were trying to get access to the console?
So when I was setting up access to the console, I actually, because I directly signed in through AWS's web browser, I did not have to do multi-factor.
Okay, so that might be a recommendation for a former client, a former colleague, right?
Employer, yeah.
Really at this point, password only isn't good enough, right? I think that's kind of like preaching something that we say all the time. You got to put MFA everywhere as much as you can, especially on the cloud. It's like every week there's like a new article around how someone's cloud got breached, S3 bucket wasn't configured correctly and it was exposed. I mean, there's so many things that can go wrong. And I think that's what scares maybe some of the people who may be more hesitant to adopt the cloud, going back to a point, Morgan, you made earlier, but it's coming. I mean, you just can't start putting, racks and racks of servers in your environment where you've got to do a good job of securing access to them. And you talk about authentication, and from my perspective, I look at it as you've got to know what you've got before you can protect it. So you got to know who has access to what. You got to know what all the different counts are, especially if you're working off the compounded problem where you're using multi-cloud and you have different, vendors. Get that inventory in place. Know what the accounts are, know what the permissions are, start to figure out which ones are human and which ones are machine, right? So a lot of development takes place. So you want to make sure that you identify, what's actually be controlled by a person, what might be more programmatic. And then I would look to centralize it as well. So I certainly agree with that approach. Maybe putting something in front of it like the SSO solution makes sense. And then using the MFA that's part of the SSO solution to get access to the cloud environment, in my mind, would probably be a good, first step towards that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I really feel strongly about is that, from a console perspective, because I think that's where someone can inflict the most damage, right? They can change settings, they can allow themselves access to many of the, instances, the server instances or the platform services through the console. So if they can get into the console with a very, very strict role or a very high level role, they could do a lot of damage. So it's kind of basic blocking and tackling of using your SSO solution, MFA, strong password policy, and then using any other policies that make business sense. I mean, you shouldn't have people accessing during certain times of the day or from different IP ranges than your corporate network, then go ahead and put those policies in place. Anything you can do to restrict access to just those folks that should be accessing that environment, all the better.
Yeah, and a lot of these vendors also have things like conditional access, right? So you can do things around geolocation, device fingerprinting, that sort of thing.
It's becoming pretty commonplace today, yeah.
Yeah, I remember when that used to be like, ooh, wow, we're cool because, we can do this and others can't. But now it's almost a standard feature amongst, most
right.
access management providers. So now it's kind of looking for ways to differentiate between those. I see things that like HashiCorp, they specialize in, cloud management, DevOps, those sorts of things that might be interesting to look at. One area that I think has a lot of potential would be more of a just-in-time provisioning of access, where people don't have permissions all the time, right? They get them just when they need them, and then those permissions are pulled back, or whatever the roles are, the entitlements are that give them access. There's products out there like Plain ID. You could even do something, through an IGA tool, Identity Governance Administration tool, like potentially SailPoint or Savient or things like Oracle or IBM. Those sorts of things.
Right.
It's a lot more complicated though when you're trying to do it that way, because you really have to know, what are the permissions, and then who's going to approve it. If it's something that's critical from like a time frame perspective, is that approver available, right, to put that in there? We see these challenges sometimes on the privileged access management side too, right? Just even inside the firewall, people getting access to servers, and there's this stigma of red tape that kind of goes around privileged access management processes that could easily, happen on the cloud side too.
Right. Where I think privileged access management really gets you the most mileage is beyond just accessing the console. When you start getting into managing your server instances and managing the accounts that have access. So one of the other tips or keys that I have is, making sure that each person who has to access servers has their own set of credentials, that you're not sharing credentials over a group of people. So for example, if you're using a Linux instance on an AWS EC2 server, those keys should be individually provisioned per person. So private keys should be private to the user. Where a privileged access management system could be really advantageous when it comes to managing those instances is to allow temporary access. Person doesn't actually need to know the password to the account on that server. And then of course you could set the firewall rules on the console to only allow the IP address or the IP range that the privileged access management server exists on to actually access the server. So then you have some network access controls, additional network access controls guarding access to that server. So some good, and that's kind of basic blocking and tackling for the enterprise. So a lot of the best practices for managing your server environment in the enterprise move over to managing those servers in the cloud as well. Jeff, one thing you mentioned about HashiCorp, what I would recommend for anybody who's listening, to go out to their website, watch some of the videos that they have posted, their tech talks with their co-CTOs. Those guys are both really, really bright, and they really understand the space, and they can walk you through a lot of the ways to approach. Now, their focus is primarily, I think, around managing DevOps, managing really secrets in the cloud, and those secrets a lot of times go back to, if you're looking at this from a developer standpoint, you're publishing applications out to the cloud. But I think that's a lot of what we're talking about today, managing a multi-cloud environment. So I think that's a really good vendor to bring up relative to this discussion. I think that DevOps is something that you don't want to forget about. How do you deploy apps without hard coding secrets? So you look at technologies like HashiCorp. It's a way to have your applications programmatically go out and fetch their secrets rather than having to hard code them into configuration files. And the same with your DevOps tools like Kubernetes, not having to hard code all those credentials into something that can be seen by multiple people within the organization.
Yeah, that takes a lot of work though too, because if you haven't built out applications with that in mind, right? If more of like a legacy type approach, trying to go back and reconfigure applications to use the programmatic means to pull keys from vaults and those sorts of things can take some time. So it's definitely not something that happens from an overnight perspective. But I think HashiCorp would be a good one to look at. Maybe something like Plain ID as well, if you're looking for more like a just-in-time provisioning. I think they have some interesting use cases that might be helpful for people who are looking at managing access to cloud environments.
The other thing I think you brought up a good point about, it's a lot of work. I don't think that an IAM program manager can go in and be confrontational, if you will, about trying to implement security. You really have to partner with the development team. They have to see the value in having checks and balances, and see the value in, the visibility that they can get and the manageability that they can get. A lot of times you run into kind of the mindset that, well, there's only 10 people in the department. They've all worked here, three or more years. We trust them. The thing is, security is, not about trusting people. It's about being able to not have to rely on trust. It's being sure that you have the security controls that everybody knows that, hey, if you try to do something, we're going to know about it. And I think from an IAM program manager perspective, the way I'd look at it is to try to partner with the manager of applications, because I think that they're going to have to adopt this technology more or less willingly for it to be a success. And they should look at the IAM team as a partner, somebody who can provide administration of these platforms and be a proper checks and balances that can allow them to focus on development and not have to focus on security as much.
Right. So I think hopefully that helps kind of put at least our opinions around that for Neil and maybe other folks who were having similar questions. I think to sum it up, right, we're fans of centralizing it, but you've got to have good policy and procedure, back-ending that, the right kind of technology approach and how you'd want to manage the permissions and making sure you don't forget about humans and non-humans, right? The programmatic side of things, DevOps, et cetera, getting access to the cloud. I'd like to kind of pivot back a little bit to Morgan and kind of talk a little bit about her background, because I think she's got kind of an interesting story where, how people, if you remember, one of our first episodes was, how people got into IAM. Most of us kind of fell into it. And I think Morgan's another good example of that. Morgan has an amazing LinkedIn profile, by the way, which I will definitely link in the show notes. So kudos to you, Morgan, on
Thank
that.
you.
Definitely shows off some of the writing skills there. Maybe you can talk, Morgan, about how you got, how did you get into IAM? I guess let's start there.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned kind of before the call, I was an English major originally, graduated and did some writing for online news journals, but there was a shift to paying writers in terms of publishing, where, there was no actual monetary value attached to your quote unquote payment. So from there, I kind of pivoted and went into code. As someone who obviously has a respect for language, I figured the language of computers might be something pretty fascinating, and I was not wrong. Definitely in some regards, kind of being a professional student, which I loved. I started attending the local weekly OWASP meetings that we have in Austin. Through that, I met someone who is one of the board members for a hospital application called OpenEMR, and that's open source and charity-based. All the developer activity on that is out of people's own pockets and time. Through that, the person who kind of recruited me onto the project saw how willing I was to learn and to kind of experiment with things. So he kind of threw me towards the AWS implementation, where we migrated the patient document database to cloud native. And that's really how I fell into identity access management.
And here you are. How long did it take to do that migration?
Gosh, I'm going to say a couple months, maybe 2 months.
And that was what, re-architecting the application, moving data stores around?
Yeah, my personal involvement with it was a little more spotty because I was learning and self-teaching, and also working on code base infrastructure at that point as well with OpenEMR. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of being thrown around there.
I think that's fascinating. It's such an interesting pivot to go from English, major, writing into technology like that. I guess, what are some of the languages that well, I guess what was the first language that you learned on the IT side of things?
Yeah, so when I first got interested in this, and I say this as in coding in general, I went to OWASP and I was initially just filling a notebook as a dictionary, basically, with terminology. And I was like, okay, does anyone have any recommendations for what I should start with? And someone said Python. So that's actually where I started. I wish I would have started with Code Academy's command line, because my knowledge quickly became kind of Swiss cheese-esque, and I had to go back a lot of times, kind of backtrack and fill in knowledge holes to understand really why things were happening and how they happened. But Python was first, and then I moved on to HTML, CSS, SQL.
That's fascinating. Jim, I think you probably have a question or two.
Yeah, so actually, one of the things I just did want to close out one other last point that I wanted to make on the best practice. I think it's just around logging and making sure that you have logging centrally set up to identify problems and setting up alerting. And it kind of triggers me into another thought. So one of the things I started off this discussion around why organizations end up in multi-cloud, and I said, well, the clouds seem pretty comparable. So in other words, if you go down kind of the checkbox list of, does it have a NoSQL database? Does it have logging? It's like, yes, yes, yes. But they all operate a little bit differently. They mostly follow some open standards and they have some proprietary connectors. And so it's probably not super easy to just pick up an application and run it in both environments and expect that you can't only do that at a very thin level, right? You have to integrate to the logging solution. So at many of the tiers of the application, you have to make them specific to the cloud that you're running in. And that's why I think it makes it harder to consolidate clouds as well. As like, you can't just pick up all your applications in one. If you're using the platform services of the cloud, if you're running everything on server instances, sure. But if you're using the logging service of your cloud provider, when you migrate that application from cloud, from AWS to Microsoft or vice versa, you're going to have to re-engineer that application some to work with the logging service of your new cloud. So that was just something I wanted to throw in there as well, is that, the idea of multi-cloud will probably be around with us for a long time, because it's not just as easy as moving a bunch of server instances from one environment to the other.
Yeah, I can't believe it. I totally skipped over the fact that you got to be able to prove everything, right? So I'm glad you brought us back to that.
No problem.
Yeah, actually, with that, that brings to mind, Identity Federation and CloudTrail with AWS, where you have a log of information about people who even requested in based on their IAM identities. So when you have decentralized logging, you have that single point of access to all salient logs that are created across accounts, regions, which is really critical for security, right? But if it's fractured with a distributed database, I would think that you really lose a lot of data integrity because of the complexity introduced there. And then I would question kind of handling failures, how you distinguish site failure and link failure.
Yeah, and one of the things
that you're running applications across multiple clouds. So this is one of the things that I've been thinking about, is that if you have a cloud, like if one of your goals is to distribute an environment, distribute an application, I don't feel like you have to have it running at AWS and Microsoft. So if one goes down, the other is available, because if you look at AWS or Microsoft, they've got data centers around the world. So I guess, if you're really paranoid about your, the entire company going down, that's one thing. But, from a geographical load balancing perspective, they've got data centers in different regions of the US and throughout the world. So my thinking is that, if you were starting out today on like, let's start our our migration to the cloud, you'd pick one vendor and spin up services in more than one geographical location. You wouldn't say, hey, let's go to 2 different vendors in case we lose a vendor.
Yeah, you don't want to overcomplicate it, especially if you're just starting out.
Right. And then, I mean, if you're going to go to the cloud, I mean, it's kind of like level 1 is just spinning up server instances. The real benefit you get is if you go to level 2, level 3, which is to leverage the platform services for your application. So if you're using a common logging platform, if you're using a common NoSQL database or SQL database, but it's as a service. Again, those services are going to look slightly different from cloud to cloud or from vendor to vendor, and your applications aren't going to be able to point exactly the same way across multiple clouds.
Right on. I think that's probably a good spot we can leave it for now. I certainly appreciate the conversation. Hopefully Neil and others get some value out of what we talked about today. Morgan, appreciate you taking the time to join us. Welcome to the team. Welcome to the party.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Jim, go Bears.
Go Eagles.
And go Bills, right, Morgan?
Yeah, go Bills. Kind of.
Kind of. All right. We're going to leave it there. Appreciate folks taking the time to listen to us. Hopefully you got some value out of it. Feel free to like, subscribe, listen, tell your friends, share the show, and we'll be talking to you on in the next one.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. To access all episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.